I was greatly influenced by my father, who was a bomber pilot during World War II. And I still retain many of his stories that he shared with me that were pretty remarkable, frankly, and one of which he won the Distinguished Flying Cross while he had one particular mission that he was on. I was in Air Force ROTC at Drake University when Drake University had an ROTC unit. Graduated from there. Actually, the same day I graduated from Drake, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant. From there, I went directly into active duty and into flight training. But when I took my eye test, it really didn't suggest that I had 20/20 vision at the time. I studied too hard, I think. Subsequently, my alternative was to go into flight training as a navigator. The flight training experience for being a navigator in the U.S. Air Force was about 9 months long, and you received all kinds of academic as well as flight training as part of that overall experience. Once I finished with the flight training as a navigator, you actually received assignments following that, and you either went on to active duty flying in an actual flying unit, or you went on to another school, either as a bomb nav person on a B-52 or electronic countermeasures person on a B-52. And I went into electronic countermeasures. I had the choice really between bomb nav and electronic countermeasures, and and interestingly, I chose the electronic countermeasures because they ejected up instead of down. The one primary interesting story I think I had was that I got married during training, and this was a highly unusual experience. My wife was in nursing school in Moline, and I had to get special authorization to leave training for the weekend, fly back to Iowa. My wife flew from while she was in Moline, and then came back to Muscatine where we got married. Then we were going to go to Chicago for a brief honeymoon, and then she was going to come back to Moline, and I was going to fly back to California. But they were having Chicago riots because that was the same weekend that Martin Luther King got shot. My assignment was to go to Michigan at the 379th Bomb Wing for B-52s at Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan. They were veterans. I was the newcomer to the crew, although we remained an integral crew for a period of time until the aircraft commander actually received a promotion and a new assignment. As a part of a nuclear alert crew, we served on alert every third week for a week at a time, and we were then responsible for responding to practice alerts where the horns across the whole base would go off. We couldn't ever go home. We just stayed in alert chat in the alert building. But we had radios where we could drive anywhere on the base, go to the bowling alley or the BX or places like that. As long as we had our truck and our radios, we could always respond to an alert that we would drive then back to the alert facility and what they call the tree, where B-52s and KC-135s are lined up. As if you saw it from the air, it would look like a tree almost. And then we would go to the airplanes immediately, start engines, and wait for our information coming as to where there was a practice or an actual alert.
And if it were an actual alert, what follows?
We would have launched, and we had pre-designated targets that we would fly to.
And the mission of your bomber was to?
It was nuclear. We had nuclear bombs on board. The crew of a B-52 included 6 people, 2 pilots, 2 navigators, what they call a radar navigator, as well as a radar bomb navigator, electronic countermeasures officer, and then a gunner that ran the tail gun for the B-52. That position, the tail gunner, has now been eliminated. They don't fly with a gunner for the tail in the B-52s currently, even though the B-52s are still flying. interestingly. But so we had 6 people that flew on the plane typically. Stateside, we would fly training missions that would be anywhere from 10 to 12 hours long. My longest mission on the B-52, wheels up to wheels down, was 25 and a half hours. We took off out of Wurtsmith Air Force Base, Michigan, flew southeast across the United States, crossed the Atlantic, and set up an orbit off the coast of Portugal. And we flew that orbit for 6 hours as a practice emergency war order, just to demonstrate we would have the capacity to do that type of mission if we were ever called to. So we orbited off the coast of Portugal for 6 hours and then flew back across the southern tip of England, past Greenland, and then back into the United States. And we were going to go back to Wurtsmith, but Wurtsmith was having a snowstorm at the time. So we landed at Plattsmouth Air Force Base in New York. And the total time wheels up to wheels down was 25 and a half hours. We had 3 heavyweight refuelings, which included over 100,000 pounds of fuel each time we refueled from KC-135s. And for those lengthy missions, we actually then had food that would be part of our overall experience as well. And there was a small little type of oven that you could actually cook meat in. And one of the best meals we could ever have was called number 1 raw. And we'd get raw steaks and we'd cook them in this convection oven that was kind of a morale issue for us as we were flying. The method of bombing in Southeast Asia was not all that different from our practice bombing in the States. They would have, when we were practice bombing in the United States, they would have radar bomb scoring sites to where you would actually be able to identify where your bomb would hit without actually releasing anything. So what would happen is, and one of the sites was just south of Lincoln, Nebraska, where we would be flying probably at about 500 feet, if you will, on a low-level introduction into the target area. And they would track us with a real high frequency, really very narrow beam radar that would track us very accurately. We would call our airspeed, our heading, and the wind, and as we're about a minute prior to target, we would have a radio go on with a solid tone. And when we would release our imaginary bombs, if you will, that tone would stop. Well, the radar bomb site on the ground would then track us and listen, and when that stopped, they would be able to predict if we had released a weapon at that time, where it would land. And that was the method of actually scoring our bombs in the United States. Well, in Southeast Asia, we reversed that process. That there were radar bomb scoring sites, or radar bombing sites, if you will. They weren't scoring us at the time. They were releasing our weapons. So we would call just as we did in the States, our heading, our airspeed, and the wind that we would have. They would give us a tone, and when that tone stopped, we would release the weapons. So they were tracking us with a very narrow India band, very high frequency radar that would be very, very accurate, and we would be able to put bombs exactly where the commanders would want to have bombs delivered from the B-52s. We served probably about 60% of our missions at the Ban-Karai Pass and the Magia Pass, which was 2 passes that were on the Laos North Vietnam border that was part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that would be moving supplies down into South Vietnam. So we were bombing those choke sites, if you will, on about an every 3-hour basis with B-52s flying into those targets. 60% of our missions were either of those 2 target areas. Then we had other targets. We bombed in South Vietnam once or twice, and there was a very interesting flight that we had up into the actual northern part of Laos. We were about 80 miles from the Chinese border at the time, and I think we were supporting some local Laotians that were our friends that needed some help. We had one actual attack where where I knew that the surface-to-air missile radar set was actually targeting our plane, that we actually went into evasive action where we were, not maintaining a straight level flight, and that I would start jamming that signal, and it was into that same target area that we knew that they had 9 SAMs fired at this other cell of B-52s. And that happened on really just one occasion. And again, this was in 1971. It was, and I actually left country before the actual, what was referred to as the Christmas bombing into Haiphong and Hanoi. If I had stayed in the Air Force, I actually got out that summer. If I had stayed in the Air Force, I would be on my second tour of what they refer to as an ArcLight tour into either Haiphong or Hanoi in terms of the bombing missions that were occurring at that time. I was thankful I didn't have to do that. I arrived in Michigan in 1969 and actually was there for 3 years until I separated from the Air Force and came back to Iowa as a civilian. For a while, I served as a high school guidance counselor in Mason City, and then from there, I was invited to go to Wartburg College, where I was director of career planning and placement at Wartburg College. But at that time, we had a small, our children were very small, and three children, we were kind of strapped for cash, and I would think, and we weren't making a whole lot of money at Wartburg College. So we started talking about what we could do to try to earn some additional cash, and I thought, well, I still have my active commission as an Air Force person, so I thought I'd come down here to the Air Guard to see if there would be an opportunity for me to earn some additional money while at the same time working on my regular job at Wartburg College. And that really turned out very well for me in the sense that I started at the 132nd Fighter Wing and then served within that wing for 22 years.